So there's a common belief that Khadijah married the Prophet ﷺ when she was 40 and he was 25. If we're approaching this as historians, we have to look beyond these numbers. We have to really look at the sources and what these sources are actually telling us. So did she marry? Was she 40 when she married the Prophet? That's the question. The first example of the number 40 is in Ibn Sa'd's Tabaqat. Ibn Sa'd, he recounts 4 narrations which mention that Khadijah was 40 and the Prophet was 25. If you go to contemporary historians with Ibn Sa'd, at that time period, this is when these texts are being written, contemporary to Ibn Sa'd, someone like Yaqubi, for example, doesn't mention anything. It's just the Prophet married a woman by the name of Khadijah. Ages aren't a factor here. The next kind of historian that mentions this 40 position is Tabari. And Tabari is operating around 300 years after the death of the Prophet. So, and he has only one narration where he says, yeah, Khadijah was 40 years old when she married the Prophet. Now, someone might look at these texts and think, okay, you know what, look, there's 4 narrations here. There's one from Tabari. That must be the case, that Khadijah got married at the age of 40. The issue is, 4 and the derivatives of 4 is a symbolic number in the Arabic language. It's not in the English language, but it is in the Arabic language. We have symbolic numbers in the English language. So 100, 1,000, a dozen. If I were to say I read 100 books, that doesn't mean I literally read 100 books. It just means I read a lot of books. So 40 operates in a very similar way. And there are lots of examples of this in the historical tradition. So for example, Abdul Hakam's Futuh al-Misr, he recounts this story of Amr ibn al-As. When he conquers Alexandria, he writes a letter to Umar ibn al-Khattab, and he says, I conquered a city. He's talking about Alexandria. I conquered a city. It has 4,000 villas. It has 4,000 baths. It has 400 palaces. One would read this and be like, it's not exactly those numbers, but it's trying to say something else, that there's a lot of what's happening. Baladu's Ansab al-Ashraf, very similar thing. The Caliph Abdul Malik is requested to send a governor to Isfahan. And he receives a lot of letters. So he gets annoyed and he says, what is this Isfahan? 40 letters have been written to me requesting a governor. So 40 and that number, as a symbolic number, occurs a lot in the Islamic tradition. We also see this in the Quran as well. Musa alayhi salam spends 30 nights and then another 10 is added and then that becomes 40. The most famous example is the most widely studied and most famous hadith text, which is the 40 hadith of An-Nawawi. That text doesn't have 40 hadith exactly. It's got more than 40 hadith, but An-Nawawi feels the need to entitle it the 40 because of the symbolism of the number. So that should give us some kind of space to pause and think, okay, these narrations are saying Khadijah got married at the age of 40. The fact that we know it's a symbolic number, we need to deal with the whole situation. Other issues also arise. So if Khadijah were to be 40 when she married the Prophet, then that would mean, and we know from the sources she had at least 6 children, she would have to be 46, 47 to give birth to all of them if that was in a consecutive time. Again, that's another issue there as well. But what makes this really interesting is that 40 isn't the only narration that we have. We also have other narrations that give other times. So as an example, Ibn Kathir, who was a famous jurist, an exegete, also a famous historian, he doesn't adopt the 40-year position. He says that Khadijah was either 35 or she was 25 when she married the Prophet. The 40 is nowhere to be seen. But what's interesting is that the earliest extant source that we have, the earliest historical seerah text that we have, is of course Ibn Ishaq's seerah. In the recension that we have of Ibn Ishaq's seerah, he doesn't mention the 40 position. He just mentions that the Prophet was 25 and he married a woman by the name of Khadijah. He doesn't say anything else. What's interesting is if you go to later sources, such as Al-Hakam's Mustadrak, he has narrations where Ibn Ishaq is one of the narrators. And in that particular narration, Ibn Ishaq is saying that Khadijah was 28 when she married the Prophet and she wasn't actually 40. So it's not unlikely, in fact, I would argue it's probable that Ibn Ishaq held the position that Khadijah was actually 28 when she married the Prophet as opposed to being 40, because we have this in that later tradition. In fact, I mentioned Ibn Sa'd's 4 narrations where he says Khadijah was 40. Interestingly enough, in the exact same text, he has another narration. He actually has 5 narrations. He has another narration where he states that Khadijah was 28 when she married the Prophet. So when you put all of this together, so for example, Khadijah's, the number of children that Khadijah had, the fact that 44 and its derivatives is a symbolic number in the Arabic language, and variant narrations, gives us a more complete picture of the historical tradition and really allows us to think that Khadijah might not actually have been 40 when she married the Prophet ﷺ, but actually considerably younger.